In the fateful summer of 1942, the German war machine embarked on its second Great Summer Offensive on the Eastern Front, codenamed Case Blue. After the strategic failure of Operation Barbarossa to capture Moscow and force a Soviet collapse in 1941, Adolf Hitler and the High Command of the Wehrmacht shifted their focus southward. The objective was clear, material, and decisive: to seize the agricultural wealth of Ukraine and the vast oil fields of the Caucasus, thereby securing the resources necessary to wage a prolonged global war while simultaneously stripping the Soviet Union of its economic backbone. To achieve this, Army Group South was divided into two powerful commands: Army Group A, tasking with driving into the Caucasus Mountains, and Army Group B, charged with protecting the northern flank along the Don River and advancing to the Volga River. Historically, as the campaign progressed, the city of Stalingrad, named after Hitler's ultimate ideological rival, became a fatal obsession for both the German and Soviet leaderships. What began as a secondary operational task to block Soviet shipping on the Volga River and secure the flank of the primary southern drive degenerated into a brutal, localized war of attrition within the industrial ruins of the city. For months, General Friedrich Paulus's 6th Army and General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army poured their best infantry and armored divisions into the urban meat grinder of Stalingrad, engaging in a primitive, close-quarters combat that the German soldiers grimly termed Rattenkrieg, or Rat War. This hyper-focus on a single municipal symbol of political prestige blinded the German High Command to the larger operational logistical reality. By pinning down their most elite mobile reserves in a static street-by-street battle of attrition, the Germans allowed the Red Army to methodically build up massive, unmolested strategic reserves on the broad, exposed flanks of the Don and Volga steppes. This operational blindness set the stage for Operation Uranus, the massive Soviet pincer counteroffensive that would ultimately encircle the 6th Army and mark the irreversible turning point of the war. In this counterfactual investigation, we explore an alternative path of extreme strategic rationality. What if the German High Command had completely bypassed the urban ruins of Stalingrad, treated it as a minor flank to be screened, and instead concentrated their mobile panzer and motorized forces on a rapid, deep operational drive to the southeast to capture Astrakhan on the Caspian Sea, permanently severing the Volga River artery? The execution of the Astrakhan Option would have required a radical departure from the historical decisions made by the German High Command in August of 1942. Historically, the 4th Panzer Army under General Hermann Hoth was initially directed toward the Caucasus but was subsequently ordered to turn north to support the 6th Army's struggling drive on Stalingrad, a move that split German armored strength and created massive logistical bottlenecks. In our counterfactual scenario, we assume that the 4th Panzer Army remains fully committed to its eastward drive, bypassing Stalingrad to the south and sweeping across the vast, arid Kalmyk Steppe. Supported by the specialized 16th Motorized Division, which historically reached the Caspian gates near Elista and Kalkuta, the German armored columns would have encountered minimal Soviet resistance in the open, flat steppe country, where the Red Army lacked the defensive depth and heavy fortifications of the city. By utilizing their superior tactical mobility and radio-coordinated air support from the Luftwaffe's 4th Air Fleet, the German panzer divisions would have rapidly advanced toward the massive delta of the Volga River, encircling and capturing the strategic Caspian port of Astrakhan. Capturing Astrakhan would have been an operational masterstroke, establishing a solid anchor at the southern mouth of the Volga River and securing a natural defensive line along the labyrinth of marshes, channels, and reed beds that defined the Caspian coastline. Rather than fighting a bloody and exhausting urban war in Stalingrad, German forces would have achieved their strategic objective of reaching the Volga in a matter of weeks, while keeping their precious panzer divisions intact, concentrated, and highly maneuverable in the open terrain. This alternative deployment would have completely upended the Soviet defense of the south, rendering the massive fortifications constructed around Stalingrad obsolete and leaving the Red Army's Trans-Caucasus front completely isolated from the rest of European Russia. To understand the catastrophic impact of the fall of Astrakhan on the Soviet war effort, one must analyze the unique and critical role of the Volga River in the economy of the Soviet Union. The Volga was not merely a geographical landmark, but the single most important shipping artery of the Soviet state, acting as a massive industrial superhighway that connected the raw materials of the south to the heavy factories of the north and the Urals. Annually, the Volga River fleet transported over 30 million tons of vital cargo, including millions of tons of grain from the Kuban and Volga steppes, chemical fertilizers, raw lumber, and, most critically, the black gold of Baku. Over 80% of the Soviet Union's domestic petroleum was produced in the Caucasus and shipped in massive river barges from Baku, across the Caspian Sea, and up the Volga River to the refineries of Saratov, Yaroslav, and Gorky, where it was processed into the diesel, petrol, and aviation gasoline that powered the Red Army. By capturing Astrakhan, the German Wehrmacht would have established an absolute blockade at the very entrance of this shipping pipeline, permanently severing the flow of oil barges northward. The immediate result would have been the complete logistical strangulation of the Soviet industrial heartland. Without a continuous supply of Caucasus crude, the heavy tank factories of Sverdlovsk and Chelyabinsk, the aircraft assembly plants of Kazan and Novosibirsk, and the administrative centers of Moscow and Gorky would have faced an immediate, irreversible fuel famine. The Soviet Union's internal distribution network, already severely strained by the loss of Western railway lines, would have been completely fractured, rendering it physically impossible to transport the material requirements of a high-intensity industrial war to the fighting fronts, and placing the Soviet state on the direct path to economic collapse. With the southern mouth of the Volga secured at Astrakhan, the German 4th Panzer Army and its supporting motorized units would have been positioned to launch a devastating offensive northward along the eastern bank of the Volga River, targeting the critical regional hubs of Saratov and Kuybyshev. Historically, Kuybyshev, located in the deep bend of the Volga River, had been designated as the alternate capital of the Soviet Union in October of 1941, when the German advance threatened to capture Moscow. The city housed the Soviet government's foreign embassies, the main administrative departments of the Commissariat of Defense, the State Planning Commission, and the executive organs of the Communist Party, making it the administrative nerve center of the wartime Soviet state. A rapid German armored drive northward from Astrakhan, operating on the open, unfortified eastern bank of the river, would have bypassed the massive Soviet defensive concentrations on the western side, throwing the entire Soviet military command into a state of absolute panic. The psychological and administrative shock of a direct German threat to Kuybyshev would have triggered a total collapse of the Soviet Union central administration. The Soviet government, forced to flee further east into the Urals or western Siberia, would have suffered a severe fracture in its command and control network, disrupting the delicate coordination of military logistics, industrial production, and national defense planning during the critical winter of 1942. Furthermore, by threatening Saratov and Kuybyshev, the Wehrmacht would have forced the Red Army to divert its remaining strategic reserves from the defense of Moscow and the preparations for their winter counter-offensive, scattering their forces in a desperate, uncoordinated attempt to plug the massive gap in their eastern flank. The ultimate target of the Astrakhan chokehold was not merely the capture of territory, but the systematic destruction of the Soviet Union's industrial sanctuaries in the Ural Mountains and Siberia. Historically, the Soviet state had successfully evacuated over 1,500 heavy factories from European Russia to the secure zones of the Urals, creating a massive, highly concentrated military-industrial complex that manufactured thousands of T-34 tanks, Yak fighters, and Katyusha rocket launchers. However, this industrial miracle possessed a fatal vulnerability: it was completely dependent on external resource inputs to survive. The Urals region, characterized by harsh climates and dense forests, was entirely incapable of producing the food and fuel necessary to sustain its massive, newly relocated industrial labor force. The millions of factory workers, engineers, and coal miners who operated the blast furnaces of Magnitogorsk and the assembly lines of Chelyabinsk depended on grain shipped from the Volga and Ukraine, and oil shipped from the Caucasus. By cutting the Volga River at Astrakhan and establishing a strategic blockade, the German Wehrmacht would have successfully severed the Ural industrial zone from its primary sources of nutrition and petroleum. The immediate consequence would have been a catastrophic industrial famine. Within weeks, the rationing of bread and fuel in the Urals would have been cut to starvation levels, triggering a severe decline in labor productivity, widespread strikes, and a massive labor flight as desperate workers abandoned their factories in search of food. The production of tanks, aircraft, and ammunition would have plummeted, depriving the Red Army of the material superiority that was historically critical in defeating the Wehrmacht on the battlefields of 1943. The military and strategic realization of the Astrakhan Option in late 1942 would have fundamentally transformed the trajectory of the Second World War, paralyzing the Red Army's offensive capabilities and freezing the Eastern Front in a strategic stalemate that favored the Axis. Historically, the Soviet victory at Stalingrad was achieved through the execution of Operation Uranus, a massive, double-envelope pincer movement that utilized over 1 million men, 900 tanks, and 1,400 aircraft, all fueled by millions of gallons of Caucasus petroleum shipped up the Volga. In our counterfactual scenario, with the Volga permanently severed at Astrakhan, the Red Army's mobile and mechanized corps would have been starved of the fuel and lubricants necessary to execute such deep operational maneuvers. The massive tank armies would have been immobilized in their assembly areas, reduced to static defensive roles, while their supporting supply trucks sat idle in the snow. Instead of a devastating German defeat and the annihilation of the Sixth Army, the Wehrmacht would have successfully secured a solid, highly defensible operational line stretching from Voronezh along the Don River, through the Kalmyk Steppe to the Volga Delta at Astrakhan. This secure defensive perimeter would have freed up massive German armored and motorized reserves to concentrate on other critical sectors, such as reinforcing Army Group Center's defenses near Moscow or completing the conquest of the Caucasus oil fields. The Soviet Union, deprived of its industrial backbone, its administrative cohesion, and its domestic fuel supplies, would have been forced to abandon its grand offensive strategies, adopting a desperate, defensive posture that relied entirely on static infantry tactics and animal-drawn logistics. By turning the Eastern Front into a localized, resource-starved stalemate, the Astrakhan chokehold would have allowed Nazi Germany to preserve its military power, prolonging the war in Europe by several years and forcing the Western Allies to shoulder a far greater share of the military burden, proving that in the end, the ultimate arbiter of modern industrial war is the unyielding flow of logistics and resources.